The streets were dark, narrow, and filled with the sound of horse hooves. The boy walked among them, small but alert, watching every move, counting every coin. He had little money, fewer opportunities, yet a mind that measured every chance. This boy was John D. Rockefeller, and the world around him was about to bend to his vision. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, a tiny town in upstate New York. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman known as much for his charm as for his dishonesty. He sold elixirs and remedies that promised to cure diseases, but were often nothing more than water and alcohol. William moved frequently, leaving his family to fend for themselves. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the opposite. Pious, disciplined, and determined, she kept the household running, instilling in John the importance of honesty, hard work, and careful financial planning. These early lessons would shape the man who would later control a vast empire. From an early age, Rockefeller displayed extraordinary focus and determination. By the time he was 10, he was already showing signs of the business instinct that would define his life. He sold candy, ran errands, and even started his first small bookkeeping enterprise. By 12, he was managing accounts for a local newspaper subscription service. Unlike other boys who played freely, John spent hours calculating costs, profits, and losses. Friends and neighbors often noticed that he seemed older than his years, cautious with money yet bold in ambition. The 1850s were a time of dramatic change in America. Railroads stretched across states, cities swelled with new factories, and coal and oil began to fuel a rapidly industrializing nation. Oil, in particular, was just beginning to emerge as a critical resource, though few understood its full potential. In 1855, Rockefeller took his first formal job at Hewitt and Tuttle, a small produce commission business in Cleveland. He impressed his employers with his precision, honesty, and relentless attention to detail. This job, though modest, gave him a taste of financial independence and control over his work. Rockefeller believed that order and discipline could conquer chaos, whether in business or life. By the 1860s, the oil boom in western Pennsylvania created opportunities for ambitious men. Drillers were striking oil, but refining it into usable kerosene was dangerous and inefficient. Many small operators failed within months due to accidents, fire, or poor management. Rockefeller saw a chance to do things differently. In 1863, he partnered with Samuel Andrews, a chemist who understood the complexities of refining crude oil into kerosene. They founded a small refinery in Cleveland. From the start, Rockefeller's approach was meticulous. He studied competitors carefully, measured every cost, and made deals that would maximize efficiency and minimize waste. At first, the business faced enormous challenges. Fires, equipment failures, and unpredictable market prices threatened their survival. Rival refineries were aggressive, often using intimidation and secretive railroad deals to protect their market share. Rockefeller, however, was patient and strategic. He negotiated rebates with railroads, allowing his shipments to move cheaper and faster than competitors. He reinvested every penny of profit into expanding his operations, gradually acquiring struggling refineries and consolidating control. In 1870, this strategy culminated in the formal creation of Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The vision Rockefeller had for Standard Oil was revolutionary. He imagined a company that controlled every aspect of the oil industry, from drilling to refining to distribution. While competitors operated independently, he sought total integration. He developed a system of centralized management, careful record-keeping, and cost-cutting methods that made his refineries far more profitable than others. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled nearly 20% of all U.S. refining capacity. By the 1880s, that figure had skyrocketed to over 90%. But Rockefeller's rise was not without controversy. His methods, now legendary, were sometimes ruthless. He negotiated secret deals with railroads to gain price advantages, pressured suppliers to stop selling to competitors, and absorbed struggling businesses to eliminate rivals. Critics called him a monopolist, while supporters called him a genius of organization and efficiency. Meanwhile, laborers endured long hours in dangerous conditions. Fires, explosions, and illness were constant threats in the refineries. Rockefeller, while philanthropic and personally modest, prioritized the growth of the empire above all else. Despite the harsh business practices, Rockefeller also cultivated a personal life of order and restraint. He was deeply religious, attending church regularly, and he maintained a strict daily routine. He gave generously to causes such as education and medical research, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the largest philanthropic networks in history. Friends and associates often noted the duality in Rockefeller. A man capable of immense personal kindness and public generosity, yet also capable of extreme shrewdness and control in business. By the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller had become the most powerful industrialist in America. His empire spanned oil, railroads, and financial networks, making him one of the richest men in history. People debated his character endlessly. Was he a visionary who built modern America, or a ruthless titan who crushed anyone in his path? Either way, there was no denying the scope of his power. He had risen from a modest boy in a small New York town to a man whose decisions could shape the economy, influence politics, and affect millions of lives. Yet, with this enormous power came new challenges. The public and the government began to question the methods of Standard Oil. Competitors sought to fight back, journalists exposed corporate practices, and labor unrest simmered in the cities. Rockefeller had built an empire, but the world around him was changing. The seeds of conflict, regulation, and reform were quietly taking root. The story of the Rockefeller dynasty was far from over. It was only beginning. The boy who had once counted pennies in the streets had transformed into a man who could control entire industries. But as the empire grew, so did the shadows around it. Enemies, critics, and legal battles loomed on the horizon. The next chapter would reveal how John D. Rockefeller wielded his power, faced enormous challenges, and shaped the modern American economy in ways the world would never forget. The world was changing faster than anyone could keep up. Factories roared with steam, railroads stretched like veins across the continent, and wealth accumulated in the hands of a few. Among them, one man stood above all, John D. Rockefeller. He had risen from a modest boy in New York to a titan who could shape the lives of millions with a single decision. Yet power always invites conflict, and Rockefeller's empire, vast as it was, faced challenges that money alone could not easily resolve. By the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil had become synonymous with the oil industry itself. From small beginnings in a Cleveland refinery, he had built a network that refined more than 90% of America's oil. His company controlled every stage of production, from the oil wells of Pennsylvania to pipelines, storage facilities, rail transport, and retail distribution. His competitors, once ambitious men trying to carve out their own slice of the market, found themselves forced either to sell to Standard Oil or face ruin. Small refineries vanished, some overnight, leaving Rockefeller as a dominant figure in an industry that was increasingly central to American life. The methods Rockefeller used to achieve this dominance were revolutionary and ruthless. He pioneered horizontal integration, buying out competing refineries to consolidate the market. Later, he implemented vertical integration, gaining control over every part of production, transportation, and sales. He negotiated secret rebates with railroads, lowering his costs while keeping competitors' prices high. He struck deals that allowed Standard Oil to transport oil for pennies while rivals paid far more. When suppliers or business partners resisted, Rockefeller often bought them out, creating a monopoly that few dared to challenge. His strategies were meticulous, calculated, and, in the eyes of many, merciless. At the same time, Rockefeller's approach to management was ahead of its time. He demanded efficiency, organization, and precision in every aspect of Standard Oil's operations. Reports, audits, and constant analysis ensured that each refinery each shipment, and each sale contributed to maximum profitability. Rockefeller personally reviewed records late into the night, studying profits, losses, and production metrics. He understood the details of chemical refining, market fluctuations, and transportation logistics better than most of his contemporaries. His attention to detail became legendary, earning him both admiration and fear. Employees knew that mistakes could be costly, but those who met his expectations found a system that rewarded discipline and skill. Yet with power came scrutiny. As Standard Oil grew, journalists, politicians, and the public began to question its dominance. Some called Rockefeller a robber baron, accusing him of crushing competition unfairly. Newspapers published exposés detailing secret deals, predatory pricing, and tactics designed to intimidate rivals. Reformers warned that Standard Oil's control over oil threatened the free market itself. The company's critics argued that no individual or corporation should hold sway over such a vital commodity, one that powered homes, factories, and cities. Meanwhile, workers endured long hours in dangerous conditions, often exposed to fire, heat, and toxic chemicals. Although Rockefeller's refineries were more efficient than many, safety standards were minimal and accidents were common. Internally, Rockefeller had to manage a growing empire that was becoming more complex by the year. He relied on a network of trusted partners, including Samuel Andrews, the chemist who helped refine kerosene, and Henry Flagler, who managed pipelines and distribution. These men shared Rockefeller's vision and discipline, but Rockefeller did not tolerate mistakes lightly. Every error, miscalculation, or inefficiency could cost thousands of dollars and weaken the company's dominance. His management style was precise and authoritarian, yet produced results unparalleled in the industrial world. Standard Oil became a machine that few understood completely, even within the company, and Rockefeller was the master engineer at its center. The political and legal environment was becoming another arena for conflict. States and local governments began investigating Standard Oil's practices, citing anti-competitive behavior and unfair business practices. Rockefeller, however, was prepared. He hired the best legal minds in the country and relied on meticulous records to defend his operations. Standard Oil argued that his dominance brought lower prices, higher efficiency, and better products to consumers. While this was partly true, the company's monopolistic power and the secret deals with railroads left many lawmakers and citizens uneasy. As the legal scrutiny increased, Rockefeller's empire faced pressures that no spreadsheet or audit could fully control. At the same time, Rockefeller began to expand internationally, seeing opportunities beyond U.S. borders. Standard Oil invested in refineries in Europe and built pipelines and shipping networks that could supply foreign markets. This international expansion added to the company's wealth and influence, but also increased its visibility and scrutiny. Standard Oil was no longer a regional powerhouse. It was a global industrial force, shaping not only the American economy but the worldwide oil market. Public perception of Rockefeller was deeply complex. To many, he was a genius, a man who transformed an entire industry and brought modern efficiency to American business. To others, he was a ruthless monopolist, crushing smaller companies and bending the market to his will. Yet Rockefeller himself remained personally disciplined and frugal. He avoided ostentation, lived simply, and maintained a strict routine. He was deeply religious, attending church regularly and adhering to a moral code he believed guided his life and business. This duality, public power versus private humility, made him both admired and feared, creating a legend that few could fully comprehend. Rockefeller's influence extended into politics, often indirectly but powerfully. Politicians courted him for campaign donations and advice, recognizing that Standard Oil's control over a vital industry gave him leverage over elections, trade, and legislation. He used this influence cautiously, avoiding direct involvement in politics, while shaping policies favorable to his business interests. This subtle mastery of both commerce and politics made him nearly untouchable, yet also drew criticism. Reformers increasingly argued that the nation could not allow a single corporation or a single man to wield so much power. By the 1890s, labor unrest, public criticism, and legal battles began to intensify. Industrialization had brought prosperity, but also inequality, urban poverty, and exploitation. Labor strikes, common in steel and railroads, demonstrated the growing tension between workers and industrial magnates. Although Standard Oil avoided the violent strike seen in other industries, worker dissatisfaction was present. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions created an undercurrent of tension that would later play a role in shaping labor laws and reform movements. The legal battle surrounding Standard Oil reached new heights by the turn of the century. Antitrust laws, still in their infancy, were designed to curb monopolies and promote competition. Rockefeller and his team responded with intricate legal defenses, arguing that Standard Oil's size and efficiency benefited the public. They contended that consumers paid less for better products because of the company's dominance. Yet, the tension between legal authority, public opinion, and corporate power was growing. Reformers, journalists, and politicians were preparing for a battle that could shake the foundation of the Rockefeller empire. Even as these pressures mounted, Rockefeller continued to expand his wealth and philanthropic influence. He invested in universities, medical research, and charitable foundations. He believed in giving back to society while continuing to grow his empire. The paradox of Rockefeller's life, ruthless businessman and generous philanthropist, was now fully evident. He shaped the industrial age, influenced politics, and transformed society. Yet he also faced mounting opposition that threatened to redefine his legacy. By the end of this period, Rockefeller had reached the peak of his power. Standard Oil dominated the oil industry, controlled transportation networks, and had become a global economic force. The empire he built was meticulous, vast, and nearly invincible. But the cracks were beginning to show. Public scrutiny, labor tensions, legal challenges, and political reformers were all testing the limits of his influence. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between Rockefeller's private empire and the emerging power of the American government and public opinion. The rise of the Rockefeller empire had reshaped the American economy and defined the industrial age. But the very forces that made him strong, his monopoly, his control over resources, and his strategic cunning, would also create vulnerabilities. The next chapter would reveal how this power was challenged, how Standard Oil confronted antitrust laws, and how Rockefeller himself would leave a lasting legacy that continues to influence business and philanthropy today. The empire that seemed untouchable began to show cracks. Power that once inspired now sparked fear and anger. Rivals whispered in courtrooms. Citizens questioned the price of progress. John D. Rockefeller had built a dynasty, but even he could not ignore the growing storm around him. By the early 20th century, public resentment towards Standard Oil had reached a boiling point. For decades, Rockefeller's company had dominated the oil industry, controlled railroads, and dictated prices. Consumers benefited from lower costs, but competitors had been crushed, small refineries absorbed, and workers endured harsh conditions. Newspapers across the nation described Standard Oil as a trust and a threat to democracy itself. Reformers argued that no single company should have such absolute control over an essential resource like oil, which powered homes, factories, and even the military. The conversation had shifted. Rockefeller's empire was no longer admired solely for efficiency. It was now under scrutiny for fairness, legality, and morality. In 1906, the pressure reached a critical point. The federal government, under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, began an investigation into Standard Oil's practices. The law had been written decades earlier to prevent monopolies, but enforcement had been sporadic. Now, the growing outrage from journalists, reformers, and politicians demanded action. The Department of Justice accused Standard Oil of illegal restraint of trade, unfair business practices, and attempts to eliminate competition through secret deals and predatory pricing. For the first time, Rockefeller faced the full weight of the government against his carefully constructed empire. The trial was monumental. Lawyers for the government argued that Standard Oil's dominance stifled competition, harmed small businesses, and threatened the principles of free market. Rockefeller's attorneys countered with careful strategy. They claimed that the company's size allowed it to reduce costs, improve efficiency, and provide better products to consumers. They presented mountains of evidence, financial reports, and testimonials from satisfied clients. Rockefeller himself rarely appeared in court, letting his lawyers handle the legal battle. Even at the peak of his wealth and influence, he understood that perception mattered as much as law. He was strategic, calculating, and patient. Despite the arguments, public opinion had already shifted. Journalists like Ida Tarbell published scathing exposés detailing Rockefeller's rise to power, the ruthless methods of Standard Oil, and the human cost of monopoly. Tarbell's work, serialized in magazines and read by millions, painted Rockefeller as the ultimate symbol of corporate greed. Her meticulous research, interviews with former associates, and careful documentation influenced the growing antitrust movement and placed additional pressure on lawmakers. The combination of legal scrutiny and public outrage created a storm even Rockefeller could not ignore. The case finally reached the Supreme Court in 1911. After years of investigation, debate, and public pressure, the court ruled that Standard Oil violated antitrust laws. The company was ordered to be broken into 34 separate entities, each independent of the others. Some of these companies would later become major corporations in their own right, including Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco. The ruling did not destroy Rockefeller's wealth. He retained shares in many of the new companies, but it fundamentally reshaped the structure of his empire. For the first time, the power he had built so meticulously was divided. The breakup of Standard Oil was not the end of Rockefeller's influence. It was a transformation, with legal battles behind him. He turned his focus increasingly toward philanthropy. Over decades, he had quietly donated millions to education, medicine, and religion, but after the dissolution of Standard Oil, his charitable work expanded dramatically. He funded the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and the Rockefeller Foundation, which became a model for organized philanthropy worldwide. He invested in public health initiatives, medical research, and scientific studies that would have a lasting global impact. His name became associated not only with industry and wealth, but with progress, innovation, and humanitarian work. Rockefeller's personal life also reflected the complexities of his legacy. He lived modestly, adhering to strict routines, religious practices, and frugal habits despite his immense wealth. He emphasized family values, discipline, and education, ensuring that his children were well prepared to continue his influence in both business and philanthropy. While the public often criticized him during his rise, by the later years of his life, many began to admire the man behind the empire, a disciplined, thoughtful individual who used his wealth to address some of society's most pressing problems. Yet, Rockefeller's story also carried important lessons. His rise demonstrated the power of vision, discipline, and strategy. He reshaped an entire industry, created enormous wealth, and built systems that influenced business practice for generations. At the same time, his fall, or rather, the forced restructuring of Standard Oil, revealed the limits of unchecked power. Monopolies, no matter how efficient or profitable, could not exist without scrutiny, regulation, and accountability. The government and public opinion played crucial roles in balancing private ambition with societal good. Rockefeller's life, therefore, became a study in the tension between innovation and ethics, ambition and responsibility. Historians continue to debate his legacy. Some describe him as a ruthless monopolist, a man who crushed competitors and exploited workers. Others celebrate him as a visionary entrepreneur, a man who transformed industry, raised efficiency standards, and invested in the future of society. The truth is complex. Rockefeller was both. He built one of the greatest fortunes in history through relentless strategy and shrewd business practices. Yet he also gave generously, supported scientific research, and created institutions that would benefit millions long after his death. Rockefeller passed away in 1937 at the age of 97, leaving behind a world fundamentally changed by his actions. By that time, The companies born from the breakup of Standard Oil had become major players in the global economy. His philanthropic foundations had begun to influence medicine, education, and public health worldwide. He had lived through the rise of industrial America, the growth of monopolies, the rise of antitrust law, and the beginnings of modern philanthropy. His life was a testament to the potential of vision, discipline, and determination, but also a cautionary tale about the concentration of power and the necessity of oversight. Even today, the Rockefeller legacy endures. ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other companies descended from Standard Oil dominate the global energy market. Rockefeller University continues to lead in medical research. The Rockefeller Foundation remains active in addressing global challenges, from disease to education. His story is studied in business schools, history classes, and political discussions as an example of both extraordinary ambition and the responsibilities that accompany immense power. In the end, the rise and fall of the Rockefeller empire teaches that wealth and influence can build nations, create innovations, and shape society. But they also demand accountability, ethics, and balance. John D. Rockefeller, the boy who once counted pennies in the streets of Richford, became a man who counted the fate of industries, economies, and people. His empire, once vast and unchallenged, was divided, but his influence, lessons, and legacy continue to ripple through history. The Rockefeller dynasty was no longer a single empire, but a network of companies, institutions, and ideas that would endure for generations. It was a story of ambition, power, conflict, and transformation, a story that reminds us that human ingenuity can create greatness, but that greatness always carries consequences. The empire that built America had changed the world, leaving a legacy both inspiring and cautionary for those who would follow.